We have now reached Unit 2, Day 5, which is going to be the last day of Unit 2. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about how the English governed the colonies and what exactly that would look like. And if you remember, the next unit, we're going to be jumping into the French and Indian / the 7 Years' War, which is going to mark a turning point in how the English governed the colonies. So let's talk about today what it looked like, how the English governed the colonies prior to that. So from 1650 to 1673, and even much longer than that, you would have the Acts of Trade and Navigation put in place. And this represented the policy of mercantilism actually put into practice. Remember, mercantilism is the idea that the colonies represent to benefit the mother country. So the act would establish 3 rules, and those rules would include with them, number 1, trade to and from the colonies would be carried only on English or colonial-built ships. So restricting trade, again, that they can only trade on those ships. All goods imported into the colonies had to go through the ports of England, and specified goods from the colonies could be exported to England only. Now, what country would this hurt? Obviously, Britain's mortal enemy, France. And with that, you're going to see that a lot of the colonies were involved in trade with the French in the Indies and other areas as well. The British were unhappy with that because they saw it as enriching the French, which they considered an enemy, but also because they wanted the colonies buying and using their services to enrich them. Now, if you're a colonist and you're looking at this, how do you think you would feel? Not very happy about it, for sure. And you're going to see the standard response to acts of trade and navigation and anything that the British do like this is that it increases smuggling within the colonies, where the colonies start smuggling in French and other made goods into the colonies. So the effects of mercantilist policies. So 1650s, you have this Navigation Act passed. You'd have the Revenue Act of 1673, which put a duty on sugar and tobacco exports, and it created customs officials to enforce these laws. Again, remember, the colonies were doing a lot of smuggling, so the British realized they need to do something about that. You also see that during this time that the English would replace the Dutch as the controllers of the West African slave trade. Now, how did the colonies feel about all this? Well, they saw it as burdensome and intrusive. They did not like that. You have the lords of trade over in Britain who start pushing for new laws to punish the colonies for not following that. So we had earlier talked about Massachusetts and New Hampshire being created out of that. The one reason why is because of all the smuggling and that kind of stuff that Massachusetts did. They were denied the claim of New Hampshire, and it gave basically a seat for the British to have some control out of, which would be New Hampshire. Also, the British would annul the charter of Massachusetts because Massachusetts is repeatedly not following these mercantilist laws. James II will come to power, and he will succeed to the throne and claims divine right. And what is this going to prompt? This is going to prompt a lot of colonial pushback. Again, remember we talked about the Enlightenment. Things are changing and people's views on government is changing. And the whole idea of James II saying, look, God has put me in this position and anything that I do comes from God. Colonists aren't going to be very happy with that viewpoint. So 1686 to 89, you would have the Dominion of New England put in place. Connecticut and Rhode Island would be merged with Massachusetts and Plymouth to form this Dominion as a royal province. And again, this was not put in place by the colonies. This was put in place by the British as a way to administer and kind of control these New England colonies. The governor of the Dominion was actually given the power to abolish the legislative assemblies that were there and rule by decree. So you see, this is almost 100 years before the American Revolution would happen, but some of the things that the British did on the onset of the American Revolution, they had tried earlier on with this Dominion of New England. The governor, Edmund Andros, who had put in place, he advocated worship in Anglican Church. Remember, a lot of people in New England had tried to escape the Anglican Church. He banned the town meetings that we talked about were frequent in the New England colonies, and he challenged land titles, which is basically who owns land in certain areas. He was not well liked in many respects. And again, showing how politics over in Great Britain would affect colonial politics here. You'd have the Glorious Revolution happen over in England, where William and Mary come to power, and the Dominion was broken up and ended as a result of the Glorious Revolution and William and Mary coming to power in England. They come to power in what is known as the Bloodless Revolution and agree to rule as constitutional monarchs. At the same time, you're going to have John Locke, who writes 2 treatises on government and writes about how the Glorious Revolution was justified and rejects this whole idea of divine right. So, colonial rebellions in response. So you're going to see that the colonies would rebel in response to James II and to other things that had been happening. So Massachusetts, Maryland, and New York all rebel against the royal government. 1689, you see Andros would actually be shipped back to England after the Dominion is broken up. They were sick of him. In Massachusetts, you'd have a new royal colony created, and religious freedom was given to members of the Anglican Church, and all male property owners could vote, and they did re-allow self-government in that area. Maryland, you're going to see that people there had a case for rebelling because over political and religious reasons and issues that they were having with the British government there. And within New York, you'd have a lot of violent political conflict. And as a result of that, more self-government would be allowed. So again, we're almost 100 years before the American Revolution. And you will see that at times that it does go that in the colonies where the colonies are very upset over British policy and make it known how upset they are. So this is setting a precedent for how the colonies are going to respond when the British really try to push them and take control of them. In 1696, a board of trade would be set up. The monarch would promote this whole idea, and the purpose of this was to supervise the American settlements. It would be very largely unsuccessful. As you're going to see, a lot of things that the British do regarding the colonies would be successful. This would be one of those things that would be unsuccessful. And again, because of this being unsuccessful, it's going to allow the colonies to kind of go back to managing themselves and really the British being kind of hands off in the colonies. So you're going to see European wars affect America. Britain and France, again, had been going to war for hundreds of years. They would fight for dominance in Europe. That would lead to issues over here in the colonies and have an effect on the Indians as the Indians would start to choose sides. In the early 1700s, you have the War of Spanish Succession would happen, which would be named Queen Anne's War here. And again, what was going over there in Europe would affect the colonies because you're going to have English settlers in the Carolinas start to attack Spanish Florida in response of this. The Carolina whites would actually arm the Creek Indians, which the Creek Indians would eventually turn on them and use the guns on them, kill 400 of them. Again, you don't need to know the specifics of these conflicts. You just need to understand the general idea that what's going over in Europe and the policies and the war and anything that's going over there, it is going to have effects on the colonies and what would happen to the colonies in the future. Here's an example. Here you can see how land is broken up as a result of Queen Anne's War, which was part of the War of Spanish Succession. And you can see the English, what they have there compared to the French and some of these disputed territories. So the British, again, they would kind of go through these spells where they would try to protect the mercantile system. Robert Walpole, who would come to lead in Parliament over there, he would try to protect British commercial interests in America without directly intervening them. So you'd see Parliament would subsidize Georgia to help protect South Carolina. So his approach was taking more of a hands-off approach, trying to do things that aren't going to directly affect the colonies. With this, you would have the War of Jenkins' Ear. It actually got named that because a dude named Jenkins got his ear cut off. And this was sparked by conflict with Spanish naval forces. France would eventually get involved. This was seen as a reason to launch an unsuccessful war against the Spanish here in America. And you're going to see with the treaty at the end of this, this would settle some of the issues with France and give Georgia to the English. So again, politics of Europe is going to have an effect on the colonies and what the colonies look like. From the large part, though, you're going to see that at this point and for quite a while, the British are kind of going to have a hands-off approach when it comes to the colony because they knew what the response was before when they tried to get really heavy-handed with them. So they are going to try to have this more hands-off approach. During this time as well, you're going to have the Iroquois fur trade. They developed a policy of what they called aggressive neutrality, meaning they traded with both sides but refused to fight with either side. Now, again, this would change, but this did work quite well for them for a while, where they just said, hey, we're going to remain neutral and trade with both sides. We don't want to get involved in all of your conflicts. So what would be the effect of the fur trade on the natives? One, they would lose land. Disease, of course, a sickness from liquor. That was something that was frequently traded with them was liquor. And even today within Native communities, you're going to see, unfortunately, there is a high level of alcoholism compared to the general population. And a lot of people trace it back to this. The effective infiltration of European goods, again, Indian society, Native societies were quite changed by all the European goods that were being brought in, that they were being introduced to. Also, they were neglecting some of those old skills that they would have learned to help them survive. Just like all of us, we kind of change and adjust with time. It's kind of like today when you look at something like a cell phone. How many of us can't imagine what we would do without a cell phone? That's the point you're going to get to with the natives, is that they're going to neglect some of these skills that they have, and because there's new technology. Also, you're going to see divided the Indian religious community. Some of them are converted to Catholicism and other forms of Christianity, and they put away some of those old forms of, you wouldn't necessarily call it religion, but to them it was a religion that they had. You will see, too, that young warriors replace the old in Indian leadership. And this isn't speaking down on young people, but young people tend to be much more energetic and energized and much more quick to make a decision than older, more wise people were, especially in this Indian leadership. And because of that, these young warriors coming in there, they're going to be more quick to declare war and to fight against the colonists during this time. And obviously, it depleted natural resources as well with the killing of so many beavers for beaver fur. You can see here this map, again, what the colonial gatherings look like. You see the French really grew in the amount of territory that they would have. So were early forms of self-government in the colonies successful? Again, like I said, the British were content to rule with a gentle hand. Even though the colonies did challenge some of their mercantilist rules, most of the time they did rule with a gentle hand. The representative assemblies wanted to have a lot of power and wished to limit the power of the crown. So slowly they would gain control over such things as taxation and appointments. And this is going to be why you're going to see at the beginning of the American Revolution, Virginia pushes so hard and says, hey, we should be able to tax ourselves. They had been doing it for a while. The British get more involved in that, and the colonists are upset about that. You would see that crowd actions were a regular part of colonial life, meaning that there would regularly be crowds marching on places. If they were upset about something, they would protest it and that kind of thing. So yes, overall, they did have a positive effects on the colonies, and they were generally successful in what they were doing in getting the colonies more power and more rights in a sense. Now, salutary neglect. Royal bureaucrats, again, made the conscious decision to relax supervision of colonial affairs and to focus on defense and trade. And this is called salutary neglect. And I always like to liken this to your parents basically saying, hey, these are the rules, but being very hands-off with them and letting you kind of do your own thing. So this idea of salutary neglect is that the British Whig, Sir Robert Walpole, he is the one that created this idea. And you're going to see it does get a lot of feedback from the British gentlemen who complained about it, because the British taxes were a whole lot higher than the colonial taxes during that time. And they were also upset with what they saw as an incompetent bureaucracy. Colonists, they were also upset with the bureaucracy put in charge of them, the royal governors, and again attempted to give more power to the representative assemblies. And these representative assemblies are going to be very important in the future, especially when we get to the American Revolution. By the 1740s, you're going to see the British start to walk back on some of these ideas of salutary neglect and try to start to replace that. Now, they would start that in small steps. After the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, is when you're going to really see that they pretty much drop salutary neglect altogether and get very, very involved within the colonies. So What were the reasons for the rise of American self-government? One, poor British policies. The British put in place things that just didn't work out, like the Dominion of New England. Those sort of things, very poor policies, did not work. Inconsistent British policies. You can already see that kind of this trend where the British put in rules and then they back off on those rules and then they decide to put in some more rules. So they're very inconsistent, which is going to cause people in the colonies to get very upset. The distance from Great Britain. Again, having an ocean between you, having pretty much 4 to 6 weeks of travel between you, that is very, very difficult. If you think about today, how much trouble our government has in governing, and they can pretty much communicate to us immediately. Can you imagine having 6 weeks of a difference in between when you're finding out information? Another reason is the colonies' desire to create their own laws. They felt that they could best represent themselves and their own viewpoints versus, again, a country that's several thousand miles over the ocean away from them. Government corruption, certainly there was some government corruption, but then there was perceived government corruption. And again, that causes and foments distrust in government. We see that in our own government today. A lot of people view our government as corrupt. Whether that's true or not, I mean, it depends on the situation. But again, that causes people to question the government, and you see a lot of distrust from government from that. And then you would have the development of republicanism, the whole idea of consent of the governed, limited government, and social contract as well. All of these things are going to lead for this push towards self-government and eventually lay the seeds for the future American Revolution. What you're going to be doing now is creating questions and responses as if you were interviewing a British official and a colonial official. You're going to create questions for each one of those, and then what their response would be to that. And these essential questions here, I'm not going to go through these, but I do encourage you to review these and see if you could answer these. These are all things that we have talked about over this unit, and basically all of it's focusing on how things were changing here in the colonies and what that meant for the colonists. So I hope you have a great day. Again, come see me if you have any questions. I'd be more than willing to help you. Have a good one.